If I gave you $100 right now, would it change your life or would it disappear? Just like every other small amount you've ever had? Think about that for a second, because this is where most people misunderstand money. They don't fail because they don't have enough. They fail because they don't understand what small money is actually supposed to do. And that's the real problem. Not income, not opportunity, but interpretation. A lot of people watching this will already be thinking, $100 is not. And that belief alone is exactly why it never becomes more. Because the truth is, $100 is not money. It's a test of behavior, a test of decision making, a test of whether you think like a consumer or like an investor. And most people fail that test instantly, not because they're careless, but because they've been trained to, trained by their environment, trained by their habits, trained by a system that teaches them to spend first and think later. So when money comes in, any amount, they don't ask, how do I multiply this? They ask, what can I get with this? And that single shift in thinking is where the entire divide begins between people who stay stuck and people who quietly move ahead. Now, here's something most people won't like hearing. If you cannot grow $100, you cannot grow $1,000. And if you cannot grow $1,000, you will never manage $100,000, not because of luck, but because the pattern is already set. Money doesn't scale people, it reveals them, it amplifies whatever behavior is already there. So if your default behavior is spending, more money just means bigger expenses. If your default behavior is distraction, more money just means more ways to escape. And this is where things get uncomfortable because it forces a different question. Not, how do I make more money? But what do I do with the money I already have? A lot of people will mentally check out right here because this isn't the exciting part. There's no quick win, no shortcut, no turn $100 into $10,000 overnight trick. Just reality. And reality is slow, structured, uncomfortable, but extremely predictable if you understand it. Let's go deeper. There are two people, both have the same $100, same starting point, same opportunity, but completely different outcomes. The first person sees $100 as relief, a break, a small reward, so they spend it, maybe on food, maybe on something they've been wanting, maybe just to feel a little better. Nothing extreme, nothing irresponsible, just normal behavior. And that's exactly the problem because normal behavior produces average results. Now, the second person does something that feels almost irrational. They don't spend it, they don't treat it as money, they treat it as a tool. And tools are not consumed, they are used. Used to create something, used to build something, used to open a door that wasn't there before. But here's where most people get confused. They think this means invest it somewhere. Stocks, crypto, something external. But that's not where this starts, because the biggest return on small money is not in markets, it's in leverage. And most people don't understand leverage correctly. They think leverage means risk, debt, big moves. But real leverage, the kind that actually changes outcomes, starts much smaller. It starts with how you use your time, how you direct your attention, how you convert information into value. And that's why most people stay stuck, because they skip this layer completely. They try to jump straight into outcomes without building the system that creates them. So the $100 never becomes anything more, not because it couldn't, but because it was never used correct. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. The goal of your first $100 is not profit, it's transformation. Transformation in how you think, how you decide, how you approach money itself. Because once that changes, then everything else becomes easier. But until that changes, nothing else works. And this is where almost everyone goes wrong. They chase outcomes without fixing inputs. They want results without changing behavior. They want growth without understanding structure. And that's why they stay in the same place year after year. Income may increase, opportunities may change, but the pattern remains the same because the system inside hasn't changed. So the real question is not, how can $100 make me rich? The real question is, can I become the kind of person who knows what to do with $100, because that person will never stay at $100 for long. And that's where everything begins. Now, let's step away from the idea of money for a moment and look at the structure behind it. Because if you only focus on the number, $100, you'll miss the entire system that decides what happens next. And that system is not financial, it's behavioral. Every financial outcome you see in the real world is the result of repeated patterns, not one big decision, not one lucky break, but small, consistent actions executed over time. And this is where most people misunderstand wealth. They think wealth is built by doing something extraordinary. In reality, it's built by avoiding predictable mistakes. Let's break this down. There are three layers that control what happens to your money: consumption, preservation, multiplication. Most people never move past the first layer. Consumption. Money comes in and immediately flows out, not because they're irresponsible, but because their entire system is designed that way. They earn to spend, they spend to feel better, and then they repeat. This is not a financial problem. It's a loop, and loops are dangerous because they feel normal. Now, the second layer, preservation. This is where people start saving. They delay spending. They try to protect what they have. And this is where most financial advice stops. Save more, spend less, be careful. And while that sounds responsible, it creates a hidden trap because preservation without multiplication is stagnation. Your money doesn't grow, it just sits, losing value slow while life keeps getting more expensive. So even though you're doing the right thing, you're not actually moving forward. You're just slowing down the decline. And this is where frustration begins because you're disciplined, but not progressive. Now, the third layer, multiplication. This is where things change, but not in the way people expect, because multiplication is not about taking big risks. It's about creating systems where effort produces more than one result, where time is not directly tied to income, where one action can create multiple outcomes. This is the layer where $100 actually starts to matter, not because of the amount, but because of how it's used. Let's get specific. If you spend $100, it's gone. If you save $100, it stays $100. But if you use $100 to create a system, even a small one, it can produce more than its original value. That's multiplication. And this is where leverage begins. Not financial leverage, behavioral leverage, using limited resources to create disproportionate results. Most people never reach this point because they're stuck choosing between spending and saving. They don't even consider building. And that's the missing layer. Building something that can return value, not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently. Now, here's where it gets deeper. The reason people don't enter the multiplication phase is not because they lack money, it's because they lack tolerance for delayed results. Multiplication is slow in the beginning, invisible, uncertain, and that makes it uncomfortable. So they go back to what feels certain: spending or safe saving. Both feel better in the short term, but both limit long term growth. And this is the structure that traps people. Not low income, not lack of opportunity, but a system where money never reaches multiplication. So the question becomes, how do you move from one layer to the next? Because that transition is where everything changes. And it doesn't happen automatically, it requires a shift, a deliberate change in how you see money, not as something to use, not as something to protect, but as something to deploy. And deployment requires intention, it requires clarity, it requires understanding where value actually comes from. Because once you understand that, you stop asking, how much do I have? And start asking, what can this create? And that shift is what separates people who stay in the loop from people who quietly exit it because they're no longer reacting to money. They're directing it, even when it's small, even when it's just $100, especially when it's just $100. Now, here's where things get even more interesting because even after understanding consumption, preservation, and multiplication, most people still don't move forward. Not because they don't get it, but because they're missing something deeper, the hidden mechanism, the part of the system that silently decides whether your effort compounds or disappears. And that mechanism is this: most people don't have a money problem, they have an allocation problem. They don't lose money because they don't earn enough. They lose money because they place it in the wrong direction every single time. Let's break that down. When most people get $100, they think in categories like spend, save, maybe invest, but they don't think in terms of return on attention, return on skill, return on positioning. And those three things are what actually control long term outcomes. because money follows value, and value is created through skill and position, not through saving, not through cutting expenses, but through increasing your ability to produce something valuable. This is the part no one talks about because it's not simple, it's not quick, and it doesn't feel like finance, but it is the foundation of everything. Let's go deeper. Imagine two people again, both have $100. The first person tries to invest it maybe in the market, maybe in something they don't fully understand. They're hoping for growth, but they're relying on external systems. The second person does something different. They allocate that $100 toward themselves, not for comfort, not for consumption, but for capability. They use it to learn something specific, to build a skill, to access information that increases their value. At first glance, this looks like no return, no visible gain, no immediate profit, and that's why most people ignore it. But this is where the real shift happens, because once your skill increases, your earning capacity changes, your opportunities expand, your decisions improve, and suddenly you're no longer limited to small amounts of money. You've changed the source. This is leverage at its core. Not using money to make money, but using money to increase your ability to create value. And that is infinitely more powerful because markets can go down. Opportunities can disappear, but skill stays. Positioning compounds, and this is why some people can lose everything and rebuild quickly, while others stay stuck even when conditions are good, because one understands the mechanism and the other is just reacting. Now, here's the part most people will skip because it requires patience, it requires long term thinking, and it doesn't give instant rewards. The first $100 you allocate correctly will not change your life immediately. It won't feel dramatic, it won't look impressive, but it will change your trajectory, and trajectory is everything. Because once direction is correct, speed becomes irrelevant. You will get there, eventually. But if direction is wrong, even speed works against you. You just reach the wrong destination faster. And this is what most people are doing. They're moving fast, working hard, earning more, but in the wrong direction. So the result never changes, only the scale does. More income, more expenses, more pressure, same outcome. And this is why understanding allocation is more important than understanding income, because income is variable. Allocation is controlled, and control is where power comes from. So when you think about $100, I don't think about what it can buy. Don't even think about how much it can grow. Think about what it can unlock, what capability it can build, what direction it can set. Because once that direction is right, everything else starts aligning slowly, quietly, but inevitably. And that's the mechanism most people never see because they're too focused on the surface to understand what's happening underneath. So now we reach the point where everything starts to shift because once you understand allocation, once you understand leverage, once you understand that $100 is not money, but direction, the question is no longer theoretical. It becomes practical. What do you actually do differently? How does this change your behavior in real life? Because understanding without execution changes nothing. And this is where most people fall apart. They understand the idea, they agree with the logic, but when the moment comes, they go back to old patterns because those patterns are automatic, comfortable, familiar. So to break that, you don't need more information. You need a system, a simple, repeatable structure that forces better decisions, even when motivation is low, even when discipline is inconsistent. This is what creates the power shift, moving from intention to design. Let's build that system from the ground up, starting with something simple. Every time money comes in, no matter how small, it gets divided immediately. Not mentally, not I'll decide later, but structurally, because delayed decisions almost always lead to consumption. So instead of one pool of money, you create three allocation buckets. And this is where the behavior changes. The first bucket, survival. This is non negotiable, basic needs, food, transport, stability. This is where most people already operate, and that's fine. But the mistake is they stop here. Everything goes into survival, and nothing is left for growth. So the system never evolves. Now, the second bucket, stability. This is where preservation lives. Savings, emergency buffer, Short-term protection, this is important because without stability, you're forced into bad decisions under pressure. But again, this is not where wealth is built. It's where risk is reduced. And then comes the third bucket, the one that almost no one prioritizes: expansion. This is where multiplication happens. This is where $100 changes meaning. Because money placed here is not meant to stay the same. It's meant to create something: skill, opportunity, access, assets, something that produces value beyond itself. Now, here's the critical shift: most people treat expansion as optional, something they'll do later when they have more money. But that's backwards. Expansion is what creates more money. So if you delay it, you delay growth itself. And this is why people stay stuck, not because they don't earn enough, but because they never allocate toward expansion early, even in small amounts, even with just $100. Now imagine this over time. Every time money comes in, a portion goes to expansion consistently, without negotiation. At first, it feels insignificant, too small to matter, but over time, it compounds, not just financially, but structurally, because now you're not just earning, you're building, you're creating systems, you're increasing your capacity. And that's when things start to accelerate. Opportunities appear, decisions improve, confidence increases, not because of motivation, but because of structure. And this is the real difference. Wealth is not built on intensity, it's built on systems: quiet, repeatable, almost boring systems that remove guesswork and replace it with direction. So when you look at $100 now, it's no longer a question of, wow, how much is this worth? It becomes, where does this go? Because that answer gut you determines everything that follows, not just today, but long term. And once that system is in place, you're no longer reacting to money. You're controlling it, even in small amounts. And that control is where real freedom begins, not when you have millions, but when your decisions stop being random and start being intentional. So now everything comes down to this: not the $100, not the strategy, not even the system, but who you become in the process of using it. Because at the highest level, money is not a tool for survival, it's a tool for positioning. And very few people ever reach that level of thinking. Most people stay focused on income, then savings, then maybe investments. But the people who actually build long term wealth think in a completely different way. They think in terms of control: control over time, control over decisions, control over opportunities. And that control doesn't come from how much you earn, it comes from what you own: ownership of assets, ownership of systems, ownership of skills that cannot be easily replaced. This is the layer where everything changes, because now you're no longer dependent on a single source. You're no longer trading time for survival. You're operating from a position of choice. And that is what real financial freedom looks like. Not luxury, not status, but optionality: the ability to choose what you do without being forced by money. And this is where most people misunderstand the journey. They think the goal is to make more. But making more without ownership just increases dependency. You earn more, you spend more, you maintain more, and suddenly you need that income just to sustain your life. That's not freedom. That's a more expensive version of the same trap. And this is why some of the highest earners feel the most stuck. Because they built income, but never built structure. They scaled effort, but never built leverage. And without leverage, there is no escape. So the real progression looks different. It starts small, with awareness, with $100, with a simple decision to stop consuming and start directing. Then it moves into structure, allocation, systems, consistency. Not exciting, but powerful. Then comes expansion, skills, opportunities, new sources of value, and finally, ownership, where your time is no longer directly tied to your income, where your decisions are not driven by pressure, where your life is not controlled by necessity. That is the full cycle, and very few people complete it, not because it's impossible, but because it requires patience, clarity, and the willingness to think differently, even when it feels uncomfortable. So when you leave this video, don't focus on the amount. Don't focus on the outcome. Focus on the shift. The shift from reacting to directing, from spending to deploying, from earning to build. Because once that shift happens, everything else follows, slowly but inevitably. And if you start seeing money this way, not as something to use, but as something to position, you won't need motivation. You won't need constant advice. You'll start recognizing patterns on your own. You'll start making better decisions naturally. And over time, those decisions compound quietly in the background until one day your situation looks completely different. Not because of one big moment, but because of hundreds of small, correct ones made consistently. That's how wealth is actually built, not dramatic, but structurally. And once you understand that, you stop chasing money and start building something that money follows. And if this way of thinking feels different, that's because it is. Most people never reach this level of clarity. But if you stay here, if you keep learning, observing, and refining how you think, you won't just earn money, you'll understand it. And that's what separates temporary success from something that actually lasts.